Thank you, Judge Patton, for such a wonderful introduction, and good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm very, very pleased to be here. I was born in Cleveland Heights, but I grew up actually up the street on Harvard Road in Orange Village. And so I am a native Clevelander. You often think about how do you get interested in topics of interest to you, and my father was a Cleveland public school teacher and actually took me as a small child on field trips. He got first started in Glenville at Harry E. Davis Junior High School, and then was later Robert H. Jameson. So in a sense, I was at least exposed to neighborhoods, despite growing up in the suburbs, that I later went on to study. And so I like to think some of that entered into my consciousness, and then I later found out about this area and undertook to study the history, interview residents. And I interviewed about 70 residents from Southeast Cleveland, not just LeeHarvard, but also Mount Pleasant, for this book. So as mentioned, I have a book coming out. It's going to be entitled Surrogate Suburbs, Black Upward Mobility and Neighborhood Change in Cleveland, 1900 to 1980. Get some lecture notes here, so I'm not totally winging it. When people ask me what's my book about, I often say it's a history of Cleveland's black middle class. And in the early part of that period, we're talking more about a middling sort, people who were on the way up, people who might have been Pullman porters, might have been building tradesmen, might have even been chauffeurs, who saved money, pooled their income, built their own homes. But really, what characterized their experience, in which I know that you all are familiar with, is moving outward in search of livable neighborhoods. So that started out in places like Mount Pleasant, it moved to places like Glenville, and then by the 1950s and 1960s it was moving to LeeHarvard, and eventually many of the most upwardly mobile African Americans moved to certain suburbs, as you well know. So I think what my book is trying to do is tell that story as an important story that is not generally acknowledged. We have some really excellent scholarly writing about African American history that's come out in the last 20 years. A lot of that has focused on the struggles that African Americans had with structural forces, how urban renewal devastated inner city neighborhoods, about job discrimination, about how deindustrialization removed factory jobs, good-paying union jobs, about how the federal government actually reinforced segregation with housing policies into the 1960s. So we know all that, but we don't often hear about how African Americans were patient, persistent, pragmatic, and frequently successful in improving their life conditions, at least the upwardly mobile ones who were in a position to move out of the inner city into places like LeeHarvard and Seville. So in other words, based on what I'm seeing, African Americans were far more successful in navigating discriminatory barriers than historians have kind of given them credit for so far. All right, I apologize, these slides may not look as good, so if anybody wants to come see the slides afterward and see the illustrations, this is a map that's going to be in my book. It's actually a map of all the African American homeowners in the city of Cleveland in 1930, and I constructed this map actually going through the entire census for that year and looking at the African American homeowners, making a note of them, and even checking out the property records if there was any question of whether they owned or not, because sometimes census takers didn't always completely fill out the form. So you can see some distinct clusters here. Of course, the bulk of homeowners are in the eastern portion of what many call Cedar Central, the central area, which contained 90% of Cleveland's African American population in 1930. But what you can also see is some outlying clusters, like in Mount Pleasant there, Seville in Miles Heights at the time. Even on the west side, the West Park of Lyndale Enclave, which is very little known, the only historic African American settlement on the west side between West 117th, West 130th along Belle Road. But really, those are the places where African Americans really escaped the intensifying segregation in Cedar Central, which was an older area of the city. In fact, the portion west of East 55th Street had some of the city's oldest housing stock, and because because whites were not willing to relinquish space for African Americans to live in, and because African Americans could not get jobs where they could afford to buy houses, even if they would have been available in many cases, they were very often compressed into that Cedar Central area. But as I was just saying, that's not the whole story. We need to look at the outlying areas where these communities developed and kind of set the paths for people to follow in subsequent decades. So what I'm going to show you here is just a kind of flip through to show you the kind of two vectors, the pathways out of Cedar Central in the northeasterly and southeasterly direction. And so you can see African Americans moving into Glenville and later into Collinwood by the 1970s and 80s, as well as out toward Mount Pleasant and down into LeeHarvard. But what you can see is already in 1940, you have a majority black census tract in the Seville area. So we'll look a little bit more about the history of that community, and it sounds like people are pretty familiar with the early history there, so a lot of this will probably be a refresher for you. But what I'm just going to do is kind of flip through the decades so that you can see the kind of pattern of population expansion. So 1950. You can see Glenville kind of coming online there, as well as Mount Pleasant around Kinsman East 126, 128th to 30th Streets. Then filling in a little further, and already at that point you see on the other side of Lee Road by 1960 some development. And then kind of filling in the southeast area, especially you see Huff suddenly becoming a majority African American neighborhood at this time. And just kind of, again, moving along those two directions. Does anybody know what you're looking at here? Heard of redlining, right? So this is an actual map produced by the federal government in 1940 that was supposedly recommending where property values were going to remain stable. Basically, banks used this to decide where not to lend money. So basically this is putting in place a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we've heard about this term, we've heard of redlining, but we don't often see these maps. In fact, historians didn't really dig these out of the National Archives until the late 1970s, and you have these for over 200, actually maybe 300 cities around the country now, and it's just putting really in stark relief the kind of discriminatory intent of these housing policies. But again, we need to remember, how did people get around these and still build lives for themselves at the urban periphery? So what you can see in the lower part of the picture is that Seville enclave that was once Miles Heights Village. You can also see Mount Pleasant up there. So basically these red areas were the so-called D-rated areas, and they sometimes had older housing, they may have had industry nearby, but if there were African Americans there, regardless of their income, that was rated as a place hazardous for investment. And as far as LeeHarvard goes, you see Shaker Heights, maybe the bend of Van Aken Boulevard up there. You see some green and blue areas, and those are recommended as the safest investments. Property values would remain stable. And to be green, or an A neighborhood, they actually had to have a deed restriction which said this house may not be sold to someone of the Negro race. And sometimes they also even specify Jews or Italians. And so you can see a portion of LeeHarvard there, bordering Shaker Heights, actually had those deed restrictions. These were outlawed by the Supreme Court in 1948. But they still continue to send a signal that African Americans were unwelcome. And you can even look in deeds today and see those in there, because you have to go through a legal proceeding to remove that. And so it's just a reminder, again, about the kind of structural factors and the kind of institutional discrimination that we all know increasingly more about. But I want to learn about how do people go about living and functioning despite these kinds of constraints that are being put in their way. Okay, so Miles Heights was, as you know, an independent village for some years. This is the village town hall. And it was basically forcibly annexed by the city of Cleveland in 1930 to 1932. It had the state's first African-American mayor, who was a Jamaican immigrant. And he believed that this was the work of Klansmen who were pushing for this annexation. And even though there was a kind of tense standoff, Miles Heights was incorporated into the city of Cleveland. Incidentally, he was elected not just with the support of Miles Heights' African-American population. There was also some significant portion of the white population who elected him or re-elected him because half of the villages, more than half, voted him into office, and the village was only 1/3 black at the time. You probably remember the Beehive Elementary School, which was built in 1917. I'm showing you a class from 1936. And so this becomes really the longest standing racially integrated Cleveland Public School. You can see black and white children there in the same classroom. And that was because of the presence of that Seville enclave that was around the vicinity of Ohio Avenue to the west of Lee Road. This school has recently been demolished, from what I understand, around 2011. So you can see here some housing that was built in this enclave. You might ask the question, how did African Americans get out here in the first place? And in fact, this was the project of Cleveland's most successful African American businessman of the 1920s, Herbert S. Chauncey, who bought a tract of land that he called the Belle Allotment out in this area. And he died in 1930 prematurely. His People's Realty Company that intended to develop this. So this is basically a way for African Americans to escape from the inner city. It went under because of the Depression and because of his own death. But black buyers continued to purchase lots in this area, and in many cases they built their own houses as they could. They sometimes didn't have a lot of money up front to do that. White residents in the area were not too happy, in some cases, for them to be moving out there. So in a way, they refused to provide sewers, they refused to provide running water, electricity, even bus service. And so this was a community that developed really as a self-sufficient community. People, in many cases, kept chickens, grew some of their own food. And basically, a lot of them were coming from the rural South. This provided some of the economic security that you could have from that former farm life if you were fortunate enough to own your own land, but also the advantages of the city. We heard mention of the Pullman Porters. There was a railroad turnaround right in the area, and you could also go and work in factories and plants closer into the city of Cleveland. So this kind of had the advantages of the countryside as well as the advantages of a modern city. But again, white people in the area were not always so understanding of the circumstances of the community. For example, in 1945, the Cleveland Press ran an article that called this Cleveland's Tobacco Road. And if you read the kind of internal memos and things, this was called a Negro slum. And quite frankly, some of these city planners were looking for ways to completely erase it. We actually had a developer, George Goudreau, who put out a proposal to completely seize this community by eminent domain and level it so that he could build a apartment complex. And that was defeated because of the high levels of homeownership and the political power that the Miles Heights Progressive League was able to muster and save the community. But that was the kind of attitude that a lot of white neighbors had regarding the community. And again, it wasn't until after World War II that this Seville enclave started getting sewers and door-to-door mail delivery. Even bus service along Lee Road was not extended until 1955. There's a picture from 1945. And so again, this was part of this series kind of exposing the conditions of concern from the opinion of the paper. Now, in the wider area, I know when I titled this LeeHarvard, but I understand there are significant distinctions between LeeHarvard, Seville, Miles Heights. So I'm just using that as kind of a catch-all term. And if you talk about this area in general, there was a lot of vacant land into the post-World War II period. And so you can see here in 1947, there's a tract here, 25 acres of land right on Lee Road for sale. This area started to be built up with the houses that we were hearing about. I'm showing you 1947, and then in about the same area, 1955, 8 years later, you can see still some vacant land, but a lot more houses having gone up. So basically, this set up a series of conflicts over how is this vacant land going to be developed. Because after World War II, a lot of more African Americans began moving into the area. Many of you may be familiar with the Seville homes. This was a temporary war housing project for African American foundry workers from the South that came here to work in munition factories or foundries during the war. And there was a temporary housing project, temporary meaning it wasn't supposed to outlast the war originally, so kind of cheaply constructed. And that was actually fought by the white residents for 2 years. It wasn't until 1944 that that could even go in, so it only served the purpose of housing war workers for about a year. And so that is in the lower left-hand corner of the map, 1950 I've got there, right next to the historic Lee Seville Black Enclave. This map you can see in my book. I'm going to talk about some of the other controversies in the area, but I think, you probably, it's hard to see the details, so I'll just kind of move on. But you can see the Seville Homes housing project in the foreground here in 1952, and this lasted until 1958 when it was demolished. But again, there's a lot of vacant land here, and there was kind of a struggle over how is this land going to be developed. A lot of African American war workers moving out of the Seville homes began building houses in the vicinity of the enclave, and even on the other side along Lee Road. And so basically, in 1951, the white councilman of this ward, it was Ward 30 at the time, Ernest Atkinson, came up with the idea that if they built a factory along Seville Road, that would basically stop the building of African American homes in the area, because you would change the zoning to industrial, and that meant that the Federal Housing Administration, which was starting to shift away from its previously racist policies, and actually it was guaranteeing mortgages for African Americans in already established African American areas, figured out if they build this factory, people aren't going to be able to get their mortgages insured. So this was kind of seized upon as a way to stop more African Americans from building houses in the area. White residents who had previously opposed industry for the ward suddenly came on board with this. So you had this struggle to preserve vacant land, and the NAACP launched a citywide campaign. It was especially active in Glenville because Glenville was experiencing some overcrowding after World War II. And despite getting all the way to practically putting this on the ballot, the building commissioner signed off, gave a building permit to this electric controller company to build a plant there. And so, again, because African American residents were a small minority of residents in the ward, they didn't yet have the political power to completely stop this. So white residents were able to force in this factory. And there are a couple other episodes along this lines that had a racial significance to them. Kind of getting a little ahead of myself. I think it makes more sense to talk about this now. There was another attempt in 1952 to build public housing in the area that white residents and some African American residents actually opposed. We know much more about the 1968 public housing controversy under Mayor Stokes, but there's an earlier public housing controversy in 1952, and also an attempt to build apartment buildings by that developer I mentioned earlier. But basically, you started getting some of these factory buildings put in the area. I just drove by this one today with Michael Fleener. We were on a tour of Lee Road, and I said, that's the factory that I'm going to be showing tonight. And so it was, again, this real struggle, how is this vacant land going to be used? And a lot of the people pushing to build these factories were using a pretty disingenuous explanation. Already, there was a concern about the city of Cleveland losing jobs. And they said, you know, if you don't let us build this factory, we're going to move out of the city. And there was a lot of vacant land on the west side. African Americans were asking, why do you want to build this here, specifically, if there's all this vacant land on the west side? And, you know, the promoters of this would say, oh, there's no racial angle at all. We welcome all people into our ward. They acknowledge that there were already African Americans living here. But again, there's a racial subtext to all this kind of development struggles going on. And really, what African Americans were most interested to do was to build single-family, suburban-style housing in the area. In fact, you even had some companies starting to build houses. You can see here it says, new homes for you, hurry, they're going fast, model homes south of miles west of Lee Road, and you can see they're FHA, VA approved. So you could get these if you're a veteran for as little as $500 down. So again, these are in a kind of restricted area. This was already an established area of African American settlement, but there started to be some building activity. So this is what the kind of idea to put a factory in was intended to put to a halt. You had some pretty amazing stories I uncovered, like Henry Hawk, who was profiled in the Cullen Post. He lived on Myrtle Avenue and actually built his home. He and his wife built their home with their own hands. There's another resident, Queenie Wade, also of Myrtle Avenue. She was a factory worker married to a truck driver, and she and her husband invested $30,000 in their property. This was more than the value of a house at this time. You could have a house for as little as $10,000 or $12,000 around this time. So to invest $30,000 in your house, they even installed the sewer lines for the house themselves. So we can think of that as an amazing story, but we can also think of it as these are the kinds of lakes that African American homeowners have to go through at the time to have this suburban lifestyle that white people just, you have to go and, you know, sign on a dotted line. So again, you have to balance the amazing story and recognize what people were able to achieve while also understanding really the kind of forces they were up against to make that happen. There were African American owned construction companies that provided hundreds of homes in this area, as well as in some places like Mount Pleasant and also on the west side in that West Park enclave I mentioned. These were typically smaller, and they faced a lot of problems in getting credit to build houses, of buying lumber at a competitive rate. So a lot of these black-owned construction firms would build in the vicinity of 15 to 25 homes in a year instead of 100 that some of the larger or more that some of the larger white-owned construction firms were able to do. So these didn't contribute, these by no means solved the housing shortage for African Americans at this time, but they really had important community significance. A lot of them were started by construction workers like Arthur Bussey that we're centering this project around, and that I'll talk about a little more detail about later. The most successful one of these firms was owned by Albert Taborn. And Taborn came here from Michigan in 1946. He became the first African American admitted to the Cleveland Home Builders Association in 1953. And he built several hundred homes, mostly in the Lee Road vicinity. He teamed up with black brick mason George Fagan. And he even developed, this is his headquarters on 105th Street in Glenville, by the way, because a lot of the people moving here were moving from neighborhoods like Glenville. So he had offices there where you could just buy houses being put up in this area. He even developed a special model called the Lorenzo, which was a house that was on a kind of preset design, and it used a special hollow brick so that you could run wires in a brick home with very little difficulty. And these proved extremely popular. In fact, one young wife told the Cullen Post, everything's so completely new, just what we wanted, not something else, not something someone else had picked out and we got second-handed later. Because again, African Americans were often put in the position of having to buy second-hand housing. Here was a case where they could buy a brand new home for an affordable cost. And so these were very successful. There are also eventually white-owned firms that started building in this area by the late 1950s. And the most significant of those was George Goodman, who built some 600 homes off Tarkington Avenue on the eastern side of Lee Road. His company actually got a loan from the Cleveland Development Foundation, and he used that to put in sewers. And so by 1962, he built over 600 homes in that area. And eventually, white firms started realizing, hey, there's some money in this. Some African-American families have money to buy these modern suburban-style homes. So you saw companies like KD Builders, Allstate Homes, Federal Homes, the Stanley Building Company. Some of these were Jewish-owned firms. The Stanley Building Company was formed by the Burnett's, two Jewish graduates of Glenville High School. And there's a long history of Jewish and African-American interaction, collaboration, and some antagonism over certain issues, but that's all covered in my book as well. But there were also Jewish-owned firms that built for African-Americans, including Burnett. But you can see these ads being promoted in the Call-in Post, again, specifically toward veterans. GI, no money down, move in this summer. Sadly, some of the African-American owned firms sometimes had, again, more difficulty keeping up with their schedules. They also had the problems with homes getting vandalized. There was one African-American owned firm, Harris and Adams, that had 4 homes practically destroyed in a single night because white residents were presumably angry that they were building outside of the established area of African-American settlement.